So thank you. It is my pleasure to introduce my colleague and my friend, Clay Johnston. Clay is the inaugural dean of the Dell Medical School and the vice president for medical affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. His vision is to create a new model for academic medicine that accelerates innovation to improve health and reduces inefficiencies in healthcare. That includes building a vital, inclusive health ecosystem to support new and innovative models of education, care, research, and community impact, all with a focus on improving health locally as a model for accelerating change nationally. Before Clay joined UT, he was the Associate Vice Chancellor for Research at the University of California, San Francisco. He also directed the Clinical and Translational Science Institute and founded the UCSF Center for Healthcare Value to engage faculty and trainees in improving the quality of care while also lowering costs. In addition to his administrative roles, Clay is a neurologist, and he has published extensively in the prevention and treatment of stroke and transient ischemic attack. He is perhaps best known for his studies describing short-term risk of stroke in patients with transient ischemic attack and identifying patients at greatest risk, and also for his work related to measuring the impact of this research. So it's my pleasure to introduce Clay Johnston.
Thank you, Sharon. So it's a great pleasure to be here. The science has been wonderful. I mean, I've taken a little break from all this administration and worrying about budgets and everything to come and actually listen and learn some science has just been wonderful. And that last policy section was also great to hear. And obviously, we're really pleased to be a part of that work, as was mentioned in the talk. And as Sharon mentioned, thank you for your introduction. She and I were out in the dark this morning running and ran out to the lighthouse and back, which was a wonderful run for anybody else. And so a great way to start the day. So in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to talk less about specific science and specific advances and more about the system in which we all work and try to think through this system. I'll focus a little more on neuroscience, but this is really more about the entire system of research and health. And it, for me, starts early in my career as a neurologist. So caring for patients is wonderful, and it also can be frustrating. And the reality is that the vast majority of decisions that we make, the major decisions we make, are not really evidence-based. Estimates are that 80% of the major decisions that are made in care are not supported by strong, non-observational evidence. Opinion being the major force that drives most decision-making. And if the clinicians in the audience examine what they do and really think about what randomized trials, what high-quality data support it, then you know that's true. So for me, in care, I got frustrated that the things that we were doing really weren't evidence-based. And an example was in this transient ischemic attack thing that Sharon mentioned. These were events that are very common, and they are treated very, very differently depending on where you went. So during my fellowship, this is what a transient ischemic attack is. It's a really simple concept. It's basically a blood vessel gets plugged up, that area of the brain stops working, so you get stroke-like symptoms, but then the clot goes away or flow develops around it, and the symptoms go away. So they're transient symptoms of stroke. And the question was what to do with these people. Really common as stroke. And at our hospital, we admitted them all to the hospital. We took it very seriously, looked for cause, tried to prevent any further events. Just across town, they sent them all home. They came into the emergency room, they'd say, don't worry about it, we'll see you in clinic in 2 weeks or whatever, and worked them up there. That's a pretty big difference for something so common and potentially important in people's lives. So this was where I started my career, is to say, well, gosh, this is something that needs to be studied. How can we study this question? And the easiest way to do it was to actually use existing data as much as possible. There was one really reliable electronic health record that was in the Kaiser system, 3 million people We could track people prospectively over time in those records. And so we just followed a year's worth of patients with transient ischemic attack, 1,800 patients over the 3 months afterwards, and we asked the question, well, what bad things happened to them? Because that's what you really care about if you're trying to ask, do I admit them to the hospital, treat them seriously, or can I just wait and leave them alone? And the answer was that lots of bad things happened. So over 10% of people had a major stroke within 3 months after their TIA. And about half of those events occurred in the first 2 days. So lots of bad things right away in these patients. And if you looked at death, myocardial infarction, or another TIA that led to a hospitalization, over a quarter of patients had those events. So that's not good. And that was important to bring that out and important to drive practice towards treating them urgently. But then, of course, the question is, well, how do we prevent those events? So this is now 1999 when I first presented this stuff. And at that time, we had a new drug, relatively new, Plavix. And you remember all those ads that fortunately we don't have to watch anymore about Plavix. But it works synergistically with aspirin to block platelet aggregation, and works in the heart to reduce the impact of cardiac ischemia and reduce the risk of cardiac ischemia in people at high risk. So the question was, could this be a good drug for patients with TIA? So we proposed that in 1999. So that was 1999. 20 years passed, and we finally got results of that trial, 19 years last year. So thankfully, my career was not dependent on this one trial and direction of research. But we finally got that out, came out just in the spring. And in fact, this combination of clopidogrel, that's the generic for Plavix, and aspirin, is highly effective at reducing the risk of stroke in these patients with TIA. Well, not only did it take that long, I mean, it was painful to us that we're doing the research, but it also delayed an important finding that could benefit people by 20 years. In spite, I mean, that all is true, but it cost us $45 million to get that trial done. So huge amount of money, huge delays, major public health impact that was delayed as well. But hey, we got it done. But that's a problem. So I equate this with the Polynesians' search for new islands, right? So you start out in Tahiti. You got all these boats going out there in the open ocean. You have a smaller number that actually get their grants, make it partway. A smaller number where they actually have important results from the things that they do, and even a smaller number that ultimately have the possibility of impacting health. Huge inefficiencies along the way, long periods of time, lots of attrition. And that impacts everything we do, right? Even on the basic science side, if you just look at in basic science, well, NIH can't not support clinical trials, right? So to support our trial, the trial itself took about 7 years. $45 million, that's what, 22 R01s? This is impacting everything we do, right? So just to make it clear, even if you're in discovery-based research. And it's driving up the costs. So now costs for average development of a new drug is just under $3 billion. $3 billion. That's a huge amount. So just to put that in perspective, just trying to think about, okay, how do you put $3 billion into perspective? Well, that's a net present cost of building a pyramid, to society there. So every drug is like investing in a new pyramid for us in society, which I think puts it into a nice perspective. But it's not just that the research is hard to get done, it's also that the research doesn't necessarily produce the change in behavior and practice that it should. So another example, another presentation that I gave in 1999 at the stroke meeting that year was about this question. So you can get weaknesses in blood vessels that create aneurysms. And around the brain, if they burst, mortality rate's about 50%. So these are dangerous things. Two approaches to treating them still are. One is to put a little clip over the neck of it. That requires opening up the skull and lifting the brain and getting in there. And the other is to go through the groin and push a catheter up and put coils in to fill the aneurysm from the inside. So this was another question that I was really interested in, because if you go to one hospital, you are clipped. If you go to another hospital, you're coiled. That doesn't make any sense. One's got to, there should be some patients who are good for one, better for the other. So we did a series of studies to show that, in fact, the coiling technique was much safer, outcomes were much better, and appeared to last for a long time. That was another concern, that it wouldn't be lasting. Randomized trial came out shortly after that, confirmed the same thing. Today, still, 25% of patients are treated with a clip. Why? Because they don't have anybody at that facility that does the coiling, or they just prefer to do the clipping, or it reimburses a little better. So example of where, in my own career, the frustrations of seeing the evidence there, but not the follow-through to do the right thing. And there's even a more important one in my area, which is, stroke prevention, hypertension, major risk factor for stroke. And about a third of adults have hypertension. But of that third, only a half are diagnosed and only half are treated of the ones that are diagnosed. So a quarter of today have their blood pressure adequately treated. That's crazy. A gazillion drugs. They're well tolerated. We know how to measure blood pressure. It's cheap as hell. And yet we can't do this. And so because of that, we have too many strokes. We have too much heart failure. We have too much renal failure. Simple problem, and we don't handle it. So really what I'm talking about is the right side of this. You got basic research, and that is so important, and to allow that to thrive. But how do we take that stuff and move it across to health improvement? And in particular, how do we deal with the massive dysfunction and inefficiencies that are happening on the right side of that and impacting the care that we all receive? Just super quickly, the global investment isn't just NIH, it's also industry. Industry's also suffering in this, although they have other ways of getting it back from us, obviously, and we see that in price increases. And in spite of those increases, we've seen pretty much flat development of new drugs in new devices. So even though things like technology has dramatically accelerated our ability to move things, to do almost every other industry efficiently, that is not the case in drug and device development. And then if you look at research, well, how much are we funding in these various areas? So if you look at sectors, pharmaceutical, biotech, medical devices actually spend a lot of money on research and development. Great, we want them to, right? That's what they tell us they're doing. But if you look at what's happening in our health care, how can we get hypertension treated in more people? How do we get diabetes controlled? How do we reduce the risk of diabetes? It's that tiny little thing at the bottom. It's this little bar here. Almost nothing is being done to support research in that area. Example are what's happening at NIH and what's happening in the federal government. PCORI, which people love to talk about, is helping to solve this problem. Only $200 million a year. It's tiny. The NIH otherwise about $1.4 billion. Sounds like a lot, but it's 4% of the NIH budget. It's about what they spend on stem cell research. So you're going to spend the same on stem cell research as you do on all these questions about how practice actually occurs. Right? So it hasn't been seen as the NIH's goal to do these things. How does it impact neuroscience specifically? Well, this just shows how the diseases are impacting us as a society. Now, the point was made about cancer. Well, how can you have MD Anderson and it's this beautiful temple and series of buildings? It's like Oz. And then you have the mental health facilities, and what do you point to as a similar one? Well, the same is also true for a lot of neurological disease as well. So it's much, much harder to make the economics work for these conditions, which is partly why that's the case. even though it's harder to make the economics of the healthcare work for these conditions, they're a huge burden to society. And you can see the numbers that, these are massive and more than cancer. So fundamentally, what is the problem? Well, one of the key problems is the way we think about care and research. We've really put a wall between these two things. We do care, and we do it in a kind of routine way that evolves very slowly. We do research, NIH-funded, long cycles, lots of attrition. And that, along with the way we fund, has created a kind of broken research system that's not generating at the rates that we want, or even with the sort of priorities we want. Again, on the right side of that diagram that I showed you, the system that we need. So that gave us an opportunity to say, gosh, can we do this a better way? And so we're trying to think about how can we do this differently. So that wall, is there a way to take that wall away and to actually bring care and research more together? To say that we should learn from every patient, that every patient is an opportunity to improve the care we provide, and in doing that, we have an obligation to innovate, to develop better models of care for each patient. So that's really about rapid cycle innovation. So how do we learn from each patient? And not how do we wait 19 years to get an answer to one single question, but how do we think about how each of the patients in front of us can be treated better? How can we learn from each one? It starts with the focus on what people want. So this is let me just this slide, it just sort of annoys me. But basically, it's trying to make the point that it's really about people that we're talking, right? It's us. When we're on the healthcare side, we want to be treated like people. And we're individuals, and we have individual notions about what we want to achieve in care. And that care should be as good as it possibly can by our terms, and it shouldn't waste our resources, right? Those are really simple. Every other industry, like the hotel here, that's the way they think of us. If they don't, they will fail. And we need to be thinking about medicine that way. That means learning from everyone, interacting with each individual, thinking about them as a whole person, all the issues that impact their health, including whether they have to go home and feed the cat, whether they have both a mental health problem and cancer. It's incredibly common. They should be treated together. All of those things we need to bring to the center. And we need to measure those things and make sure that we're delivering on the promise, changing our system to evolve it, improve it, if we're not achieving those results. So I could have given a bunch of different examples, and as I was thinking about the last panel, I could have used bipolar disease, which is another one that we've rebuilt. But basically, what we do is we start from scratch. If the goal is to create the best care possible for people with this condition, what does that care look like? How does it involve technologies? How does it involve people? What's that team look like? Forget about fee-for-service and how we get paid today. Think about how you achieve the best outcomes you can. And then design the care that way, use principles of human-centered design, and track outcomes and modify outcomes over time to your system to continuously improve. So for cognitive impairment, this is different triage mechanisms that exist in the front end to get the right people into the right place. Counseling is a big part of what we do. There's a lot of caregiver support, a lot of risk factor management, and then this constant measurement for outcomes. And I don't have time to go into details about how it's working, but it is. And we've seen that outcomes, patient-reported outcomes, and traditional outcomes that are measured in systems improve for all the conditions that we redesigned this way. And for everything that we've done so far, the costs have come down. Now, just to make it real, though, that doesn't mean that our profits are there. So in a fee-for-service system, we actually are losing money on these patients today because we're doing things that are not covered by fee-for-service. They're the right things for the patient, but they're not covered. That's a hard thing to do, and we can't continue to do that. We have to change the business model in order to get paid for the outcomes for the patients, and we're starting to see that, not in this area, but in, for example, in knee pain, hip pain, back pain. Those are all ones where now we get paid for our outcomes, not just from the surgery, but from managing the whole thing. And that's making the economics very, very positive for us. So this is the thing that we do over and over again in all these different areas. It's about measurement of outcomes. It's about getting paid for value. But then design, technology, team, and the clinical expertise all sort of come together to create these models of care. Integrated practice units is another name for it. And then we have to focus, too, on how these models are disseminated. So how do we take what we do locally, disseminate it across the county, but also think about, okay, people who get their care from us, they don't necessarily want to have to come back every month if they live in, here, to come back to Austin. So how do we create those networks of care that allow us to reach to them and provide that, the long-term care that they're going to need? And then once this is set up, we can start to build the science on top of it. It itself is science, right? We're learning from every patient, we're adapting our models, but then we can do things like we can randomize. Do we do a telemedicine visit as a start-in visit? Sounds like a minor thing, it is, but for people it matters. Do you want to have your first visit by telemedicine, or would you rather wait a couple weeks and come in and be seen? And then we can do things like use monitoring technologies to layer in to adapt therapies more rapidly. So this is something we're doing in Parkinson's disease. So Merck has gotten really interested in this. We have a broader partnership with Merck. And so Merck is helping us to study these Parkinson's patients, again, layering on these monitors, Fitbit, simple monitors, but how does that teach us about how to modify drugs in patients with Parkinson's? And this one doesn't relate to mental health, this example, but I just love it, so I always have to tell it because it's just so clear. The joint pain one, as I said, was one of the ones that's most mature for us, the model. And the group was like, when you start to fix things and you're like, gosh, this really sticks out as weird. So they still use hacksaws in the operating room to prepare bone for these surgeries, like the same kind of hacksaw you'd pull out of your garage to cut a pipe. More sanitary, but otherwise the same thing. And it destroys tissue, it's hard to manipulate, it's hard to control. So we put out a call, can we do better than a hacksaw? And we got a bunch of ideas. The best one, though, came from UT Engineering. And an engineering professor who'd actually worked with one of our medical students who was part of the project and an orthopedic surgeon came together. The engineer was working on cold laser technology to cut pipes in the oil and gas field. And it ended up, and so they got her first cow bones and then human bones to work with, and it works beautifully. They had to modify it, fix it to work properly, but it works beautifully, and we're not sure at this point whether that will ultimately get out licensed or whether a new company will be created around it, but we already have interest in the out licensing. So a good example of how when you create this, and we're looking at all these outcomes too, so we can see how these things impact outcomes in the real world constantly. So for us, it's really about how do we keep a North Star? How do we keep the North Star being in these improvements of health the way we want our health system to be? And then discipline, again, I'm just talking about the right side of that development cascade. How do we discipline that part to achieve that as efficiently as possible? Innovation is a big problem at that end, so how do we accelerate innovation? How do we learn from it as quickly as possible? And then put that into practice as extensively as possible. Thank you very much. One question? So there's time for just one question. Go ahead.
Congratulations on a great talk and a great concept. I was a very pragmatic question in terms of timeline taking this forward. Just earlier we heard about the Texas-wide effort in mental health care. Do you see this T2 effort, this kind of iterative assessment of efficacy that effectiveness that you're looking at as something you want to model in Dell, or as something that can be a Texas-wide effort from the start?
I think it should be a Texas-wide effort as much as, I mean, I think some of the things that we're doing are really risky, and I don't necessarily encourage other institutions to do it until they see how we fail. So, you know, the business models. But in the area that you described for like mental health, no, absolutely, I think there are huge opportunities to do that. So as part of the, you know, the Austin State Hospital project that was discussed, we're really, as David Lakey said, we're really interested in that as an opportunity to just look at the whole dysfunctional mental health system. Hospital is just one piece. It's the least relevant piece to providing the right care for those people, but it is the most expensive. It's the one the state has taken on paying. So in doing that, there's actually been a much larger human-centered design project to think about how to redesign that whole care pathway. So we're ready to pilot pieces of that fairly quickly in Austin, but the goal would be to say, gosh, take what works and let's make that broader. And we don't think we have the ideas in Austin and the rest of the state doesn't. I mean, it'd be wonderful if those things were piloted across the state all at the same time, and then we're all sharing those components and moving things forward.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You have one more, but short, quick.
Umair Shah, Health Department Director, Harris County Public Health. So fantastic talk. I just wanted to say very quickly, similar to the last question, that the schools of medicine and bringing in schools of public health is an absolutely incredibly important value proposition of integration. And that model that you just referred to, how do you see the ability to get this out to legislators, policymakers, to really describe this importance of the intersection point? Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the reason we haven't done that as much is because we want more successes to make the case, right? So these are, you know, when they're conceptual ideas, great, you know, they sound wonderful, but is it gonna work? I mean, practically, is it gonna work? And the economic piece of it, just as I said, is the most difficult part. Now, that being said, we've already got some successes, right? So we already know that some things are working. And the way we've been able to accelerate this work actually is with the county health districts. So with Central Health, our county health district, we can do this work much more quickly because they're excited about it and they de-risk it for us. So basically they pay us cost. So we can create these models without fear of loss, and then once we move to commercial, then that's when we take a hit. So I think there is great opportunity to do this. Episcopal Health Foundation's been particularly interested in how we create that larger framework for doing this on a statewide basis. And they're starting to fund our next cycle of ideas that happen out into the community. And so I think that's a great opportunity for us to be looking more statewide and how we move systems like this forward. That's great. I gave you a shout out. You gave a shout out back to health department. So great, fantastic. Yeah. Thank you. Yes, sir. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.